just a moment, the press preview. First look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. But first, our top stories on Sky News. Sky News has been on the front line of the fight against Islamic State as a coalition of forces attempts to rid Raqqa in Syria of the terrorists. An inquiry into the Grenfell Tower fire has begun with a minute's silence to remember the victims. The chairman was accused of failing the survivors by refusing to allow one of them onto his panel. The number of people arrested for terrorism offences increased by almost 70% in the past year and is now at a record high of 379. Hello there, you're watching the press preview. First look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with the political journalist Isabel Oakeshott and the Observer's chief leader writer, Sonia Sodha. So let's have a look at what's on some of those front pages. The Eye leads with today's inquiry into the Grenfell Tower fire and anger among survivors over how they were treated. A court heard a lorry driver accused of killing 8 people on the M1 didn't have a licence and was asleep at the wheel. That's in the Metro. The Financial Times suggests the Bank of England is poised to raise interest rates. Well, staying at a healthy weight can cut the risk of high blood pressure by almost half, according to research in the Express. That comes as the Times reports GPs are being told to refer almost 2 million overweight people to taxpayer-funded cooking and exercise classes. The Mail says councils have been told to increase the construction of new homes by up to 40% over the next decade to tackle the housing crisis. NHS workers have demanded a 3.9% wage rise. That's in the Daily Mirror. Well, The Guardian also has that story reporting health unions are also seeking payments to make up for lost earnings during austerity. The Sun leads with the death of a British journalist after he was pulled underwater by a crocodile in Sri Lanka. The Telegraph claims spending cuts mean the Royal Navy can now barely protect the United Kingdom. And The Star reports on the death of Luella Michi at a festival. Well, I'm joined now by Isabel Oakeshott and Sonia Sodha. Good to see you both. Thanks for joining us on the show. Let's go straight to the story which is on the front of the Eye. This story that we and everybody else has really been reporting on, that of the inquiry into Grenfell.
Yeah, well, rather predictably, I think, the inquiry has got off to a controversial start, and immediately there are complaints from some of the families and relatives of victims of this dreadful fire that the judges in some way disrespected them and that they feel that this hasn't really got off on the sort of footing that they wanted it to. My feeling about it is that really the inquiry ought to be allowed to get some underway before people start complaining about it. Obviously, the families of victims have been through the most horrific experience, but it seems to me a great shame to start kind of dissing the inquiry before it's really started. In a way, you've got to feel some respect for the judge and what he's taken on. It's not really, he's a retired judge. It's an extraordinarily onerous task to take on in a very sort of highly strung atmosphere, and I really feel that he ought to be allowed to get on with the job.
Yeah, Sonia, it started well. I mean, he got the tone right. They had the minute silence, but it was that failure to answer questions at the end. That's what's been controversial.
That's right, and I agree with Isabel that this isn't an easy thing to take on by any stretch of the imagination. But I think these sorts of inquiries have to strike an incredibly difficult balance, actually, between taking the legalistic approach, being incredibly forensic, producing the right answers independently, which is what everyone wants in this inquiry, but also winning the trust of people who lost loved ones in the fire, or people who survived the fire. And I think it is a difficult balance to strike, but I think it's had a difficult start on the first day, and I think there are flags and reasons for concern. I am more concerned than Isabel about this. I think some of the criticism has been that the tone of the judge's 45-minute speech was incredibly legalistic. It wasn't very sort of layperson friendly. It was hard to penetrate. When the QC acting for some of the families asked to make a short statement on behalf of the victims, that wasn't allowed. The judge appeared to ignore that QC. It's very difficult to know exactly what happened, but that just doesn't set the right tone.
What about this issue of having somebody from the community on the panel? Is that something that should happen?
Well, I mean, I think the judge is there to make a legal, examine the evidence. That's what he's there for, to get to the heart of things. And he has said that he feels that were that the case, that might actually affect his impartiality. I mean, I think we have to be clear what this inquiry is actually for, and it's look to see whether the building met certain regulations. It's to look to see whether there is culpability anywhere. It isn't actually there as a kind of mopping up tears exercise. I don't mean to say that in a sort of inhumane way, because clearly, you know, there are people who have suffered massively over this, but there are different forums for dealing with different sections of the aftermath of this, and this is a legal thing.
But obviously the inquiry's number one purpose has to be to get to the truth, but I think it will only ever get to the truth if it has the trust of people who are affected by this terrible tragedy.
It sometimes feels as if they want to complain at every step of the way.
That's not fair, Isabel. There's an incredible amount of anger, I think, in that community, quite rightly so, given this awful tragedy that befell them, but also the way it's been handled by the council and by the government since. So only 2 families have been successfully rehoused since a fire. You know, it was a number of weeks ago. So I think that trust is difficult to win, and I think lots of families have said that themselves because they've been through so much. But the inquiry has to make every effort to do so, otherwise it's not going to produce a truth that is believed and trusted by everyone. It's incredibly important that it's believed and trusted by the community
Incredibly important, incredibly difficult as well, so we'll have to see how this all plays out. Let's move on to this story, which is on the front page of the Telegraph. So there was a time that Britain ruled the waves. According to the paper, that's no longer the case.
Well, this is a subject that's really dear to my heart because
She's writing a book on it.
Thank you for that, Sonia. Not specifically on the Navy, but certainly covering the state of the Navy. And, I mean, the fact is that the Navy has lots of positive news to report at the moment. Virtually no one can have missed the arrival of the wonderful new aircraft carriers. But the flip side of that, and you will hear the Defence Secretary saying everything's fabulous and we're putting lots more money and resources into the Navy. The flip side of it is there are a number of defence projects which have really hollowed out the defence budget. And the defence budget has gone through years of very swinging cuts. And the result of that is that in many cases they simply don't have the personnel. So they might have the ships, but they haven't got enough people to actually sail them, as it were. They might have the aircraft carriers, but they don't have the aircraft on them.
I guess the government would say that the way that we operate is different. So you don't need, I guess, what you needed, I don't know, 30 years ago. You know, the way things are done is...
Well, I mean, that might. I'm sure that's absolutely changed. I'm no expert on defence in the same way that Isabel is, but even
I'm not calling myself an expert.
But you know, even I can sort of look at this story and say, why spend the money on all this very expensive kit if there aren't people to operate it? I'm afraid I don't think that things have changed 30 years on. Defence really cuts it, and for me, this is just yet another example of another area of public spending that's been affected by unnecessary cuts over the last 7 years. Everywhere you look, whether it's education, looking at schools and further education, whether it's the NHS, whether it's prisons, for example, whether it's indeed welfare spending and tax credits for low-income working families, parts of the public sector have come under increasingly intolerable amounts of strain, I think.
And parts of the public sector are calling for an increase in pay. This is a story which is on the front page of the Mirror. It says, it's got the headline, 1 million NHS staff in 3.9% pay war.
So would you actually, Sonia, I was delighted to hear implication there that you actually think there should be more defence spending. Is that your position?
Yeah, I would absolutely be. I've never said I'm not in favour, but I mean,
it's an unusual position for someone on your side of the political spectrum. I'm really happy. This is why This is why I like her so much, because she's not entirely predictable.
I am.
But what she is
predictable. If I had an extra £1, I would spend it on schools before defence. But I'm not saying that defence shouldn't get more money.
Okay, but you want more money for everything, and I do. That's where we have a problem.
That's
where I'm predictable.
She wants lots of sweeties, and that simply means more borrowing, which.
On this,
taxing the very
on this
wealthy
issue
as well.
of pay rises in the public sector, I mean, Theresa May was criticised about the pay rise for police officers, for example. I mean, what do you think? How is this going to end up?
Well, I think it became politically untenable for Theresa May not to give some inch on this issue. It's been really dogging her politically for quite a long time. So I saw this coming. I think a lot of political observers did some months ago. But, you know, the problem is that the public sector is never going to be satisfied. So just you give it 1 or 2% pay rise and they want 3% or they want 4%. So you have to decide where the line is. Sonia is absolutely
Sonia,
bursting to come in here. So
I am bursting to come in because this is ridiculous. So nurses, policemen haven't had a pay rise, a real pay rise. Prices have been going up. Private sector pay's been going up. Some nurses have had a real pay decrease of thousands of pounds a nurse on a starting salary since 7 years ago. When you've even got the Independent Institute for Fiscal Studies saying that the public sector pay freeze is now starting to affect recruitment in the public sector, and that the government's going to have real problems with recruitment unless it puts pay up. We've got real problems, and it was completely untenable, not just politically, but also, I think, in moral terms for the government not to budget this public sector pay cap.
Well, I think real problems are when you borrow and borrow and borrow and the books don't balance. And at the bottom line is we have got to live within our means, and unfortunately we cannot afford to keep dishing out pay rises.
I'm afraid living within our means just doesn't cut it when you've got nurses having to visit food banks.
It's Sonia's magic money tree.
Okay, let's end with this story, which is on the front page of The Sun. Croc kills surf Brits. 24. What's this one about?
Yeah, it's a really tragic story. So it's actually someone from within our industry. It's a journalist from the Financial Times who seems to have met the terrible tragedy on holiday in Sri Lanka. I was quite surprised to know that there were actually kind of man-eating crocodiles in Sri Lanka. It's not something I've been to Sri Lanka. It's something I was aware of.
Yeah, and I mean, what can you say? It's just awful. You know, a 24-year-old goes on holiday and is killed by a crocodile. It's just a dreadful story.
Horrendous. Condolences to his family. We're just going to pause just for a few minutes for a very short break. Do stay with us. Still to come. Fighting the flab. The NHS wants us to lose much more weight. Stay with us.